NK News has launched a new app that makes staying updated on all things North Korea easier than ever. The app gives access to the latest articles so you'll never miss a breaking story. It's fast, convenient, and designed with readers in mind. Our team is dedicated to bringing you the most accurate and insightful information about North Korea with content and analysis unavailable elsewhere. Don't delay. Download the NK News app from Apple's App Store or Google Play and stay connected with the latest North Korea news and analysis. The app also works with NK Pro subscriptions, offering full access to NK Pro content. Hello listeners and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and this is the last episode for 2023. So I'm joined here in the studio by Chad O'Carroll, founder and boss of NK News and NK Pro. Hello Chad, welcome on the show.
Hi, good afternoon, Jacko. Good to see you again.
Now Chad, you've been busy lately surveying over 100 expert North Korea watchers to write your 7-part end-of-year series called Next Steps for North Korea. And we're going to go over some of your more interesting findings in this podcast. But first, could you tell listeners why you carried out this survey and why our listeners should get on the nknews.org website right after listening, of course, to us first and checking out all 7 installments of Next Steps for North Korea?
Yeah, so I guess since the very early days of NK News, we've always tried to aggregate views from across the North Korea watcher community. And on the early days, it would be like what we call an expert's opinion piece, where we'd bring together 4 or 5 experts, usually from diverse backgrounds, and ask them the same 4 or 5 questions and then publish their thoughts in aggregate. I think we do that a little less than we used to. Those articles used to turn into like 2,000-3,000 words material. So monographs. Yeah. So I guess from that, we, in 2021, the 10-year anniversary of Kim Jongun's taking power from Kim Jong-il, we decided to do a survey of a much larger number, and we did a Google Forms survey. I think we had about 85 participants then. And that survey asked about how people judged Kim Jong-un to have done. It got some really interesting responses. It got a lot of media attention, and that was 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago. So we just decided to do that again, but rather than looking backwards, this time the focus of all the questions was to look forward, or at least to sort of anchor on something contemporary.
Now, before we get stuck into the serious stuff, you also spent some time early this month watching videos of the once French, now Russian actor Gerard Depardieu. Can you explain?
Yeah, so bizarrely, I went to a journalist gathering a few weeks ago, and I was talking to some French journalists, and they said, oh, make sure you're watching French TV tomorrow. There's going to be this brand new documentary about Gerard Depardieu. Some of the listeners may remember him from Green Card in the late 80s, early 90s. But yeah, that documentary dropped, and it was using a lot of footage that was recorded in North Korea, incidentally on a media tour in September 2018 that I and Oliver Hotham, our former editor, happened to be on. So
2018. So this is well before COVID then.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And we all knew that Depardieu was there. He was getting pretty drunk during the tour. His minder was being very obnoxious and aggressive. We did a couple.
You mean he's Korean?
His
local
French minder.
Oh, he's French minded.
Who's some kind of minor French comedian, minor celebrity. Mm-hmm. We did a couple stories on it back then, and then nothing came of it. And it seems that the documentary they were recording while we were all together in North Korea never came out, never saw the light of day. And then somehow the clips all got leaked to this French documentary maker. And
5 years later.
5 years later. And in that, he's saying a lot of very inappropriate stuff. So yeah, we can talk about that a bit later. But yeah, I think, it's good and... No, there's nothing good about it. But I was going to say it's good and bad, but...
He hasn't put out a lot of good work in the last few years, shall we say.
No, and I do remember while he was in North Korea on that trip, rumours had just emerged that he'd been charged with, or there was some kind of rape allegations that he'd literally been involved with 2 weeks prior in France and gone straight to North Korea. And North Korea always attracts a motley community of individuals and people, and I guess that was just another example of one of those
Wow, how odd. Okay.
strange people.
All right, well, let's get into the serious stuff then. Let's begin with the first of your series of articles written after surveying over 100 experts on the best policy towards North Korea. This first article is called North Korea's Next Steps: How Can the West and South Korea Influence Pyongyang? So you asked the question, given Kim Jong-un's rapidly warming relations with China and Russia, what is the best way for, quote-unquote, like-minded countries, the West, Republic of Korea and Japan, to influence the DPRK in meaningful ways? And there were 5 different opinions, the least popular being to, quote, utilize a combination of economic incentives and targeted sanctions to influence the DPRK's policy decisions. Only 5.7% of the surveyed experts thought this was the best approach. And why do you think that is, given that this is the approach that Western governments generally say is the right one and the one that they always practice?
Well, it's the theme that you'll see across the survey as we discuss the results in this podcast, that I'd say active policies right now were pretty dimly viewed across the board. I don't think anyone thinks they work anymore. But yeah, I think it just reflected that, 5.7% of votes, it was just a handful of people. One person said, it would be better, maybe this could work more if there was more of a balance between engagement and accountability. I think that's maybe true. So
a carrot and stick approach?
Yeah, exactly. We haven't exactly seen, even in the era of diplomacy and summitry of 2018, 2019, some would say that the carrot was Kim Jong-un's ability to meet these world leaders. I don't think that was a carrot personally, but there was no concession that was provided besides Donald Trump's sort of off-the-cuff cessation of large-scale US rock exercises.
Right.
But even that wasn't delivered upon along the lines that Kim Jong-un had been told, i.e. all exercises stopping. That didn't take place.
Now, the most popular single choice was, quote, increase diplomatic efforts, including high-level talks and summits, to directly engage with the DPRK. And that got 20.8% of experts' approval. Now, why do you think this is so popular? Wasn't this tried by Trump and Moon without too much success?
Well, you could argue it was very successful. It was the first time we've seen a North Korean leader engage with the US, leader to leader, at summit level. And the North Koreans did stop ICBM long-range missile testing for the duration of the summitry. There was no nuclear test. These are the kind of wins that Trump used to highlight a lot. And people mock Trump for those. But, if we look at what's going on now, you can argue it was bad faith. The North Koreans always wanted to cheat, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, they didn't test those weapon systems. I've lost count of how many ICBMs we're on now, even under Biden's watch. And no nuclear test at all since then. But at least there was some appetite on the North Koreans for pausing, even if it wasn't full pause, just something of a pause is better than nothing.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people on the more hawkish end of the spectrum don't see it like that. But frankly, they bring zero credible ideas on how to stop North Korea's nuclear weapons program at this point. So I think we were always going to have something imperfect.
Now, it's also interesting that almost 1 in 4 of the respondents opted for a mixture of different policies and approaches working together rather than any one single approach, while still others suggested pursuing rapprochement with China. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think probably this is where I would land on things as well. I think no one single policy can be expected to yield results and also to be pursued long term, because of course presidents change in democratic systems and we inevitably have a kind of flip-flop between pressure and carrots. Yeah, as we'll probably talk about, information efforts, I think, are one of the areas that have not really been seriously tested.
You mean pumping information into North Korea from the outside against the wishes of the Pyongyang government?
I think that was one of the results in this survey. I can't remember, is it this question or not? Anyway, maybe it's not this one. But yeah, information going in, I think, has to be part of a strategy. Some people worry that it could provoke the North Koreans. I think you could have said that about sanctions, diplomatic isolation efforts, proliferation security initiative. But we do know that information is seen as the Achilles heel of Kim Jong-un's system.
But those are the things that seem to get the North Korean government most exercised, right?
Information.
Yeah, when North Korea literally threatens to shoot something, it's usually related to information smuggling to North Korea. So, if you continue to use those loudspeakers, we'll shoot those loudspeakers. Or if you continue to send balloons, we'll shell the place where the balloons are coming from.
Yep.
So are there any safe ways to get information into North Korea?
Yeah, well, I think those are threats that North Korea has made increasingly under the Kim Jongun system. We did see some shells launched, I think 2014, launched towards where balloons were launched. So they have partially shown themselves to be credible in that area. But this is an area civil society can do things under the radar. It's also an area where government can do things that don't, information campaigns don't have to be provocative. They could be merely like making it easier for North Koreans, much easier to listen to existing international radio stations that just happen to be in this region. So, growing up in London when I was a kid, I could listen to AM, and at night I could hear radio from Europe, France, Netherlands, Ireland, and my curiosity led me to tune into those stations. So yeah, just things like that could help. But yeah, I think it's an area that's underutilized, and especially if we ever have a crisis or some kind of near the US or other countries really want to send a message, it could be used more proactively and aggressively. I wouldn't rule out being able to stimulate talks, because can't remember if it was there was loudspeakers that the South Koreans were using under Park Geun-hye.
2015-16.
They got really agitated about that.
Did, yeah.
And I seem to remember there being talks at Kaesong involving the conditions for turning those off.
Huh.
Now, I might be mixing things up, but yeah.
Okay. Let's move on to your second story. How successful is Yoon's interKorean policy? And the question was, to date, how do you assess South Korea's approach to the DPRK under President Yoon Suk-yeol? In response, over 29% of respondents said that his audacious initiative policy offering aid in return for denuclearization steps was highly ineffective due to, quote, failing to address key issues and worsening relations with the DPRK. Now, given that North Korea seems to be the one eschewing dialogue and engagement at this time, I wonder what approach would have been deemed more effective.
Well, not just 29% saying it's very ineffective, but another 29% saying it's somewhat ineffective. So we had almost 60% of 106 North Korea experts from around the world judging the current South Korean president's policy towards North Korea to be ineffective. Now, we didn't ask them what they'd suggest instead, but I think that's a pretty startling statistic that many people think that what this government is doing is not going to bring South Korea to a better place when it comes to inter-Korean relations. Doesn't surprise me, but yeah, it's startling that so many people, just 3 people, actually thought that what Yoon is doing is very effective. And I know who those are. I'm not going to call them out on the podcast, but 2 of them live in DC, and I think that's by itself very interesting, that people may see things differently from that Beltway area.
Do you think it's correct to say that North Korea issues, including denuclearization, have not been a priority for the Yoon administration?
Denuclearization's not been?
Well, North Korea issues in general, but including denuclearization. Yeah,
it clearly is not a priority. The audacious initiative has the hallmarks and characteristics of really a policy that has been put together, I think, by architects who knew it was never going to work. It's just a way of parking the issue, if I'm being cynical about it, for another administration to pick up, while being able to stand back and say, well, we're open to dialogue, we're open to support, here are the conditions. But I've said this for a while, I don't think the Biden administration or the Yoon administration is serious in any way about North Korea, even denuclearization. And the goal, I think, frankly, is to avoid crisis during those presidential leaders' watches of the presidential office of their respective countries. That's probably the goal. Just have no crisis. Kick the can down the road.
Based on your conversation with experts, is there any common theme on how President Yoon could improve his track record on North Korea policy and approaches?
No, I mean, the question we asked was judgment, really, on this particular one. It wasn't really asking. We do ask in another question about what people think would be the best way forward. But Off the top of my head, I can't think of.
All right, we'll save that one till the end then. So your third piece looks at the question, in the event the next United States president expresses strong interest in direct talks with the DPRK, how open do you think Kim Jong-un could be to a further round of summitry and negotiation? And we're at the end of December 2023, so about 11 months out from the US presidential election. At this stage, the top two contenders are Joe Biden and Donald Trump again. So it was interesting to see that highly interested and highly uninterested, both tied with 11.3% of respondents choosing these options. What does that tell us? That two mutually contradictory responses would draw more than 10% of support?
Yeah, I think it's just maybe somewhat revealing of personal preferences in politics and hopes and objectives. Maybe, skepticism of things as well. I found this was a hard one to write about because it was such a divisive question. Yeah, even as you go up the sort of results, I think number one was 34% said that Kim Jong-un would be, quote, skeptical with limited interest in talks, and number two was moderately interested in talks, and number three was cautiously optimistic. So yeah, overall, no strong. The leading responses were more about an ambiguous response from Kim Jong-un, and to be honest, I think they're probably right. Kim Jong-un was badly burnt at Hanoi. It's a big question in my mind. Let's say Trump comes back in November of 2024. Would Kim be interested if Trump was making public pronouncements that he'd like to talk again? Maybe they'd meet, maybe they would exchange some more letters, but I think the onus this time would seriously be on the White House to make a major concession up front, or do you remember back in 2019, Kim Jong-un kept saying "Seron Bangbop," like they wanted a new method or a new way from the Americans, and I think it would be very hard for Kim to persuade or to gain the good faith support of military security forces who have risen in prominence in the last few years to support more talks.
Okay, let's go on to your fourth article, and that dealt with a favorite topic of yours and mine, and one we've talked about on this podcast many times, and that is sanctions. And the question asked of the 100 plus experts surveyed was, how do you perceive the future of the global DPRK sanctions regime and its relevance going forward? And coming in at last place were 13.2% who said that those who said that the sanctions regime will continue at the current level of effectiveness and relevance, maintaining pressure on North Korea. Some experts added that the US could do more to increase pressure. What could the US do more to increase pressure?
One respondent, Bruce Klinger of the Heritage Foundation, pointed out that there could be greater enforcement of existing laws, particularly against Chinese banks thought to be involved in, facilitating some of North Korea's financial transactions. I think that's a fair point. There is probably more that the US could do, but
not by itself, but sort of through in prompting China.
No, but I think by itself there is sanctions architects and advocates like Joshua Stanton of One Free Korea have long said that the US within its existing unilateral sanctions could do a lot more to pressure North Korea. Like, for example, these Chinese banks, regional banks that North Korea is thought to leverage to move money around the international system against sanctions using accounts, for example, owned by sympathetic Chinese nationals or profiles that they've just stolen somehow. The US could do serious damage to the reputation of those banks and make them think very differently about facilitating that kind of financial activity. But, and this is where I think sometimes the North Korea sanctions specialists could do is maybe thinking a bit broader. There will be knock-on effects with something like that, and China is a huge trading partner of the US. Yep. We know the Chinese government tends to have a tit-for-tat approach when it comes to so-called long-arm sanctions. And I don't think that could happen in isolation and just further American goals and objectives on North Korea without there being some major consequence for US foreign policy in another area. That is probably why Washington holds back on that to some extent.
Now, slightly over a quarter of respondents said that the sanctions regime will become both ineffective and irrelevant, failing to influence the DPRK's actions or international relations. Now, I think it's no secret that you're quite skeptical on sanctions. Do you think that they'll become both ineffective and irrelevant, Chad?
I think, ineffective, that's already happening when it comes to China and Russia on certain types of activities. But they're still relevant because there are, on the Chinese side, definitely no interest in certain major outright breaches of UN Security Council resolutions. And on the Russian side, now let's assume what the US has said is true, that the North Koreans are arming the Russians. Well, the Russians are making a lot of effort to at least pretend that's not true.
Right.
And they're not being, if what America says is accurate, they're not being honest about things. So that means there is still a cost for sanctions that they don't want to incur by doing this activity. At the same time, I think Russia is unlikely to, just transparently, for example, start selling North Korea aircraft or other designated items just because of the summit that Kim Jongun recently had with Vladimir Putin. So I think that I'd probably fall on the sanctions are becoming less effective, but they still have relevance. But that could change.
How or why?
Well, again, let's say, we have to caveat by saying, if what Russia is said to have done is true, that they've recently purchased large amounts of North Korean munitions, shells, artillery, then that would constitute a sort of high-level watermark in terms of brazenness, I'd say, amongst at least one UN Security Council member, one of the P5. And that creates a precedent. So that means the cost for, let's say, China to do something more that would have been much more controversial in the past has diminished.
Right.
And it also means that, other third countries, maybe in Southeast Asia or Middle East or Africa or Latin America, might start to think, well, maybe we could start getting, do you remember North Korea used to send military advisors to Uganda, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Zimbabwe.
Yeah, things like that. That's where we could start to see quite high-profile sanctioned activity start to reinvigorate itself.
Right.
And
So that one major effect of sanctions is that it forces support for North Korea to be kept at a sort of a semi-hidden level. It's not too obvious. It's not too out in the public.
Yeah.
And the danger is that if faith in them continues to fall, that states and non-state actors alike will continue to stop caring and do things more openly.
Yeah, exactly. And on the flip side, when you think about recent US efforts to impose new sanctions, China and Russia have vetoed. Well, we've recently seen the US implement the veto on the Hamas Israel question.
Yes.
The only country to do that at the Security Council.
Right.
And I think from a North Korea perspective, the US doesn't have the moral high ground to point to China and Russia and claim that they are disingenuously utilizing their veto power to further their foreign policy interests when they're doing exactly that in Washington. So I think I don't want to go off piece too much, but it's Boxing Day today, and this morning on BBC News I'm reading about how Netanyahu plans to expand the offensive in Gaza. So that could be an issue that could really stretch Washington's own credibility on peace and security at the Security Council more and more in the months ahead.
Showing the interconnectedness of things. One of the survey respondents said he believes that sanctions have pushed the DPRK toward China and away from South Korea. Do you think that's correct? Was it sanctions that pushed North Korea towards China?
Well, I think it was already on that way. But I say that the summits of 2018, the sanctions regime was in full place back then.
Yeah.
So, I think certainly after 2019, after February, when Trump walked away, Kim realized that much warmer relations with China, especially China back then, could serve North Korean economic interests by increasing China to turn a blind eye to the more low-level activities like ship-to-ship transfers of fuel, refined petroleum products, oil, things of that ilk. Chinese have been very uninterested in penalizing North Korea for that kind of stuff.
Right.
The Russia stuff more recently, I think I know some people see this as a kind of ideological affinity. For me, it looks more transactional and akin to something that could fizzle out quite quickly in the event Putin signs a peace deal with Ukraine in a year or two from now. And somehow, if Russia becomes more reintegrated with the world after this war ends, as it inevitably will one day, Russia may have much less interest in associating with the likes of North Korea.
Now, your fifth piece discussed a question that has become a hot topic in South Korea over the last 2 years. How likely do you think it is that South Korea begins a nuclear weapons program to counter the DPRK within the next 10 years? Now, if somebody had asked me the likelihood of this happening 10 years ago, I would have said it didn't seem likely at all. But I still believe that it's probably not likely to happen. The only difference is that it's now actually a topic of polite conversation. Do you agree?
Yeah, I was quite surprised at the results. I thought we were going to get many more votes for highly likely.
Oh, really? Highly likely? Okay.
That's just, I don't know. I guess we've got some factors that will play out next year if Trump comes back and if he starts pressuring South Korea to pay more again, and if he is questioning the alliance, wants to bring troops home, things like that, then yeah, maybe highly likely or moderately likely would be quite a credible position. But
which right now is at adding highly and moderately likely together, it's 26.4%.
Yeah, quarter. But I think people are right to think about the economic and political consequences, and some of the respondents did point that out. I think it was, I forget who said it. Yeah. Ramon Pacheco-Pardo of King's College London said, and this was interesting, South Korea knows it won't face serious consequences from its partners if it acquires nukes. That's why I think it'll be the behavior of the US towards South Korea that will determine whether South Korea goes nuclear or not. I think he is probably spot on with that. I think what we're seeing in the wake of the Washington Declaration, where South Korea needs these constant port calls of nuclear submarines and strategic assets like aircraft carriers, and the sort of unwritten rule is that in return for that, South Korea shuts up on and stifles probably government participation in debates about whether or not South Korea goes nuclear. I think that may work for now, but again, if Trump comes back and is not supportive of all of this, then I would see growing rationale for South Korea to consider going nuclear. And to be honest, if you think about the future of international relations and South Korea not being able to really count on anything forever, it probably makes sense to have an ultimate insurance program long term. And, you know, we've seen the double standards on nuclear issues play out just less than 2 decades ago with India. After, I think it was 2007, 2008, George Bush just decided that, you know, we should look over the need to punish India too much for its nuclear program and integrate it. And I can see something similar with South Korea, understanding its special circumstances.
Yeah, it's hard to see the public having a great appetite for that, though. As Steve Tharp likes to point out to me, and I think he wrote in a recent op-ed piece for NK News, that if you think about how much resistance there was and on the street protest when the THAAD anti-missile missiles were brought in 2016, try to imagine what would occur here in South Korea if nuclear weapons were stationed at some base. And even if they were South Korean domestic nuclear weapons, people would somehow find out eventually, you know, within 6 months to a year, word would leak out that here's where they are, and that it would create a lot of agitation, I think.
But there are South Korean military bases and air bases all over the place, and isn't it the same argument? People would get really, you know.
But nuclear weapons themselves are a target. I mean, that would be the first.
But the nuclear weapons, like, would probably be based in a submarine that the location of which would be unknown to anyone in North Korea. That's how the UK does it. France does it. And if South Korea did it, I would imagine they would do something like that. And the locations of all of the air bases that would be used in any conflict are well known. Those would be first on North Korea's target list. So I don't know. But you're right. It was a big issue with THAAD, but that, I guess, THAAD, we all knew the golf course it was going to be on. With this, I guess the production facilities would be But then, you've also got a huge nuclear infrastructure already that could be targeted, like power stations, things of that ilk. Yeah, we'll see. But I think Ramon is right that this could be papered over by all sides in a way that doesn't create huge penalty for South Korea if they do decide to do this eventually. The other flip side is, I think someone pointed out in the survey, is South Korea can already, you could do what Japan has done and continue building its nuclear infrastructure to the point where if there's a political decision within a limited time frame, it could develop nuclear fissile materials for nuclear weapons.
But what's that limited time frame? Minutes, days, weeks?
Well, some say in Japan 6 months. Some say it's quicker, but I mean, they would then need to presumably pair with missile systems, and I can't,
Because it's hard to imagine that North Korea will just sit on its haunches and do nothing as South Korea says, okay, we've got 6 months, we're going to,
I guess it could do things in secret like it did in the
1970s. Park Chung-hee.
Park Chung-hee, he got caught.
Now, your sixth piece looks at the more immediate question of to what extent will the DPRK have opened its borders to foreigners by the end of next year, end of 2024. Before you asked this question, what were you personally expecting in terms of North Korea's reopening next year?
Well, I have grown increasingly skeptical that we're going to return to 2019. And I think the more likely outcome is a fuzzy version of a first and second class framework of international relations where China and Russia are given carte blanche to kind of go back to 2019, but where Western European countries, maybe some of the Middle Eastern ones that have relations, and those in Southeast Asia are kind of treated as second-class citizens. Maybe the likes of Syria and Iran will have a better chance of getting new diplomats in, but I can just imagine there being lots of red tape and friction to strongly discourage people to want to come back.
Where would the UN agencies fit in this two-tier scenario?
Yeah, UN, it's hard to predict on that because while they do provide a means for North Korea to get lots of free support, we know in the past that North Korea has not exactly embraced the UN. Like just in 2019, it was telling the UN to shrink its permanent staff presence inside North Korea. I think it was UNDP and one of the other agencies it targeted said that the results of their work was basically meaningless and that they should downsize as a result. Now, I think what they'd really like is to have a bare minimum, maybe just a very limited monitoring capability, and then they quote unquote do the work.
They being the North Koreans?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, so this scenario of a two-tiered reopening with China and Russia offered normal privileges, that was the second most popular survey response with 26.4%. The tie for the third most popular answer was that the extent of border opening is uncertain and highly dependent on external factors, including global health situations and diplomatic relations. Can you say anything more about the possible external factors that might affect the opening?
Yeah, again, Ramon Pacheco Pardo, he said that health emergencies that play out in the months ahead or concerns about that, things like that could really turn things around. Simon Cockrell, Koryo Tours, the general manager there, he said he wanted to be optimistic about what's coming up, but that it's often easier to do nothing than to do something in North Korea, which I kind of get where he's coming from on that.
Kind of inertia.
Yeah, and Don Kirk, a veteran journalist here in Seoul, said that he thinks that the full normalization would be highly contingent on how relations with places like the US and South Korea evolves in the years ahead.
Okay, and 16% were very optimistic, saying that North Korea would be fully open by the end of next year, including tourism similar to pre-pandemic levels, which really is looking on the bright side of things, isn't it?
One of those people included Jacko Zvetslut, a NK News podcast host.
Who's he? I don't know.
Former Koryo Tours guide. Was that something to do with your other affiliation? Have you been paid to say that? How does that work?
I'm struck dumb here. I don't know what to say. Did I really say? Did I say fully open? Okay.
Yeah. You said it will be an orderly progression starting from embassies in the UN and favoured foreigners, but I understand some have got visas already who are not the usual suspects.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then perhaps on that day I must have been feeling pretty optimistic. But Yeah, a year's a long time,
True.
and so it could be, if in April they could start with the embassies, and then perhaps by the end of December they're talking about having tours in. We'll see.
Yeah, and they could really surprise us all once again and just go completely gangbusters and go back to normal in spring.
North Korea is full of surprises. Did the results of the survey change your mind at all?
On this, it's a hard one. I think number one most popular was the two-tiered reopening that I described. I always with North Korea, I wonder if there's part of the fact that we are quite a small community of people that talk a lot amongst ourselves, and I wonder if there's any echo chamber that is playing out, and it may even reflect in things like this.
Right. Yeah, there's certainly a danger of that, isn't there?
Yeah.
Although, as we did see from the survey results, even if there is an echo chamber effect, there are some views that are completely mutually exclusive or mutually contradictory, right? So it doesn't. There is diversity of voices in there.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, your last article in the series, the 7th, is called Next Steps for North Korea. Where will the country be 5 years from now? And there's certainly some diversity there. The full question is, if international policy doesn't change, what will be the most significant result for the DPRK in 2028? Now, the scariest answer for me, personally, living here in South Korea, was that North Korea will have invaded or attempted to invade South Korea. Luckily, only 1.9% believe this is the case. That's
two people.
2 people.
Yeah.
Did they leave any longer comments there?
Well, yeah, one person said North Korea is running out of options. China and Russia cannot or will not give them what it wants. So an attempt to complete the revolution is one of the few viable escape routes from its plight. I can't disagree with that, but I would strongly disagree that it would be an attractive option for North Korea to escape from its plight. It'd be a very highly risky one.
Mm-hmm.
But the person is right that if it played its cards well, won this war, it could benefit from the strong economy here and have it all funneling theoretically towards the Kim system.
But that assumes US inaction, doesn't it?
Yeah, there are a lot of big ifs in this, but
there's some built-in assumptions there.
Or it assumes, it assumes also, I guess, from Kim Jong-un's perspective, that the threat of annihilating much of the US would prevent the US from meaningfully responding.
Yeah, well, which leads to the same thing. It's either US inaction caused by the threat of harm to itself, or US inaction caused by an end of the alliance, or US inaction caused by lack of interest.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, whatever the cause is, the result is the same. Yeah.
And you think that it wouldn't work well. Like, let's say Kim Jong-un won this theoretical war and inherited much of South Korea. I guess some would argue, well, he'd be isolated and ostracized. Well, look who's coming out of isolation at the moment. Bashar al-Assad becoming regularly invited throughout the Middle Eastern region to participate in summits and meetings.
Yeah, was he at COP recently in Dubai, or did he send somebody?
I don't know the answer to that, but I know he was in Saudi recently, UAE. He met with, he's coming out of sort of isolation. And then you also just think, after Crimea, like Putin, Russia kind of just totally normalized that for some years, and maybe they will after this war ends.
Back to the survey, a little over 10% see North Korea undergoing a major humanitarian crisis and serious food shortages, kind of like in the 1990s, but with a well-fed core elite and improved nuclear and missile capabilities. So that's kind of a repeat of the 1990s, but a stronger North Korea that is able to ward off any external threats to itself.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a major humanitarian crisis like we did with the famine of the mid-90s. I just don't think that's in China's interest to allow to play out on its border when it can, for relatively little, prop up North Korea with both cereal, agriculture, fertilizer, and medical supplies. China in the mid-1990s was in a vastly different economic position.
Yeah, and also if the last 3.5 years of self-imposed COVID isolation didn't cause a massive critical humanitarian crisis in North Korea, then you'd have to ask, well, what would?
Yeah, some kind of new disease. I don't know. alien invasion.
Wow, okay. 17% of the respondents predicted that having secured modest global sanctions relief, North Korea will be experiencing slow economic growth and continuing to develop nuclear weapons capabilities. And I wonder how these experts see North Korea gaining global sanctions relief, even modest relief, when Russia and China have proposed this at the UN Security Council. It got knocked down. So how would that even be a possibility, global sanctions relief, while continuing to build nuclear weapons capabilities?
Well, let's not forget it's getting practical sanctions relief.
Right, okay.
That's one side of it. But I think it's possible to foresee a pathway towards actual formal sanctions relief if, after the next US election, there is someone in the White House who is concerned with the threat that North Korea poses and thinks we can pay off or mitigate some of this threat by dialing down some of the sanctions. I'm sure China and Russia would support that at the UN Security Council. So yeah, maybe that's where this is coming from.
Now, the lion's share, or 38.7%, predicted that North Korea will be continuing a policy of isolationism while experiencing ongoing economic decay and worsening humanitarian conditions. And I think that scenario is compatible with a North Korea that is still close to China and Russia, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think this is probably the likely direction from here.
I was curious about the 13.2% of experts who chose other in that list of possible scenarios. What was the most interesting one of those that you recall?
I don't have my notes here of the full quotes on that, I'm afraid.
All right. Well, out of all these survey results, which one surprised you the most?
I'd say it was probably the one about South Korea going nuclear. Like I said, I thought there would be more consensus that this is actually going to happen, or there's a strong chance it's going to happen. But actually, people didn't seem to think that. That went against the grain of my thought. The interKorean one was, like I said, probably the headline for me of all of this, that people really have a dim view across 106 North Korea experts that the Yoon administration its policy is ineffective, either very or somewhat.
On the basis of these survey responses and your analysis of the results, or completely separate of them if you prefer, are you prepared to make any bold or unusual predictions for North Korea-related news in 2024?
Well, we are going to be doing predictions formally in the next week or so and publishing those on, I think, January 10th or 11th. So we'll have a bundle of predictions for then.
But let me ask you for a teaser right now on the hop.
Well, I was thinking, though it goes against what I feel, just if I was a betting man, I would actually put money on the outside chance of North Korea fully normalizing its border by spring. I would put money on that as a kind of outside possibility that would have a high yield return on the win.
A fully normalized border by spring?
Yeah, mostly. Yeah, like so tourists back, Western countries back, diplomats exploring how to get back, NGOs and UN starting to reopen. Like I said, it doesn't strike me as being compatible with where everything's going, but I think it's the kind of outside bet I would see as being most likely.
How about a nuclear test for next year?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, throw that in.
Why not? Because there is the US presidential election.
Oh, yeah.
And that would be a good way of putting North Korea back on the map ahead of an election. I don't know if the North Koreans care too much to influence who gets the vote, but it would help put it back on the map as a problem that needs to be solved. Now, why is that relevant? Because 2021, there was the 5-year military plan. So 2026, that will be over, right? Which it will be a year into the next US president's term. And maybe that's when they could be open for dialogue, having got to the point with the military that, they can take a breather. So putting the issue back on the agenda before that could be in North Korea's interests.
I'm going to make a very safe prediction
here. What do you think?
I think that I've been saying it for the last few months. I think that Kim is going to have some kind of summit diplomacy with China, whether he goes there or somebody visits Pyongyang. But it hasn't happened so far, so it'll have to happen in 24, or China will be miffed in some way, I think. So.
Yeah. And what are your predictions on Wonsan Kalma getting finished plus the Pyongyang General Hospital.
Yeah, I was thinking about that hospital there. That's still way behind schedule, and it hasn't been finished yet. So I think that I would imagine the hospital would get finished first in terms of order priority. So let's put that one down for next year. And Kalmar, like the Ryugyong Hotel, stays a semi-finished shell for another year.
Or maybe longer.
Right, but I'm only going to the end of 2024. Yeah. So since this is our last episode for 2023, any final thoughts to leave us with, Chad?
Well, thanks everyone for tuning into the podcast every week, for reading the website, for subscribing. We really appreciate your interest in the subject. Not only does it nourish us with food and economic security, but I think it gives us the subscription fees we generate from all of this really helps give us a great canvas to report on North Korea in a way that's free from interference or niggling from grant providers who want us to focus on peace and security only. Like, there's a lot of this in this field that it's kind of a dirty secret. But I'm glad we don't have any South Korean government funding. We don't have any American government funding. We're just basically running on subscriptions. And I think that's how it should be. And I hope that with your ongoing readership and loyalty, we can take things further in the year ahead.
And on that note, in the year ahead, look out for more merchandise, NK News themed merchandise.
I'm just working on some T-shirts right now.
Yeah, don't tell us too much yet. Just leave it as a tantalizing thing there. All right, well, thank you very much, Chad, for coming on the last episode for 2023. Listeners, it's been a great year working for you once again, and come back next year for more, and follow us on the Twitter. Thank you and goodbye. Let me ask you this. You're listening to the NK News podcast, so you know more about North Korea than most. But how about the South? To really understand what's happening on the peninsula, you need to know about South Korea. And now you can, through our new Korea Pro news and analysis service. This is not your average news service. It's a thoroughly researched analysis of South Korea's politics, society, and economy from an international perspective. But you know what the cherry on top is? The absolute lack of commercial influences. No ads, no sponsored articles, it's just pure, objective analysis by a team of qualified specialists. And the best part? As a listener of this podcast, you get a 25% discount. All you have to do is use the coupon code PODCAST during your sign-up. So head over to koreapro.org/podcast and start your journey with Korea Pro. That's koreapro.org/podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.